It says, look at how great a love the Father has given us, that we should be called God's children, and we are. The reason the world does not know us is that it didn't know Him. Dear friends, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet been revealed. We know that when He appears, we will be like Him, because we will see Him as He is. And everyone who has this hope in Him purifies himself, just as He is pure. Let's open with a word of prayer. Father God, this is the day that our country sets aside to honor and to recognize fathers. And we just want to take a moment and do that. And God, I guess let me personally say that I'm grateful for my father. God, I think of all the fathers that are here and just ask that you would bless them as they seek to be the men that you have called them to be. And yet, God, when we look at you, we affirm that you are the best father that we ever could or ever will have. And we praise you for that. God, we are gathered here to worship and to honor and glorify you. Ask that you would be here, that you would bless us, that you would watch over us during this time, that you would just fill us with your presence, and that you would lead us in this service. We ask these things in Jesus' name.
So
worship you because of that. God, as we just take a few moments and as we open your word together, God, we confess that it is you who inspired these words to be written. And we just ask that you would speak to us, that you would move within us, that you would change our hearts because of your word. God, we give you this time and ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. As we continue in the book of Philippians, I came to this part of the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of Philippians chapter 2. Just know that there's a stretch here that all kind of goes together. And as I was looking at the text and just working through it, I realized there is way too much here, especially when you think of chapter 2 and you think about what it says about Christ at the near the beginning of chapter 2. And so I decided we're just going to break this into 2 weeks. So we're just going to work through the 3 or 4 verses at the end of Philippians chapter 1 this week. And then we'll work at the beginning of chapter 2 next week. But just know at the outset that some of the themes that we're going to talk about today will carry over to next week as well. So as we think about living in a manner worthy of the gospel, know that it's going to continue with that theme, and it's going to continue to explore that theme, and ultimately give us the example of Christ and say, this is how you should live. You should look at Jesus' example and follow it and live like that, but that will be next week. So for this week, Philippians chapter 1, and we will start in verse 27. The text says, just one thing. Live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then whether I come and see you or am absent, I will hear about you, that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, working side by side for the faith of the gospel, not being frightened in any way because of your opponents. This is evidence of their destruction, but of your deliverance. And this is from God, for it has been given to you on Christ's behalf, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him, having the same struggle that you saw I had and now hear about me. There is something that is incredibly or inherently, I think, challenging of living as a Christian, as a Christ follower in the world today. And it seems like so often people take kind of one or go in one of two directions. We're either tempted to drift towards, I guess, dominance or dominating or trying to dominate the culture. Or it seems like we're tempted to drift towards passivity in that, well, whatever comes and you know, whatever happens and that's okay. Big picture, I think one of the things that we see here is this text is telling us that really both extremes are wrong. There's a sense of submission, there's a sense of humility that is woven through this text, and again will carry over into next week. But there's also a sense in which if you're a believer, if you're a Christ follower, then you need to live like that. And that's going to mean certain things, and that's going to mean that at certain times you're going to be at odds with the culture that surrounds you. Not that we're called to necessarily be overbearing or to dominate it, but we are called to live. Look at verse 27. Just one thing, the text starts out. Just one thing. Live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Somebody wrote a poem, and I don't even know who it was or when it was written, but it fits. Now listen to this. It says, you are writing a gospel, a chapter each day, by deeds that you do, by words that you say. Men read what you write, whether faithless or true. Say, what is the gospel according to you? It's kind of a witty poem, but it makes a good point. The song that Ali sang for the offertory, if you caught the words, but it's talking about writing this story on my heart. It's a biblical idea. 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 2, you yourselves are our letter, written on our hearts, recognized and read by everybody. This is Paul writing to the church in Corinth and saying, look, your lives bear witness to the gospel, to the truths that have been handed down to you. And we see this instruction, live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Talk is cheap. You know, this becomes cliche, I guess, that actions speak louder than words. And yet that's what the text says. How we live matters. If we're going to live out the gospel, if we have the gospel written on our hearts, then it ought to be written on our lives as well. And maybe we need to back up and say, okay, well, what exactly is the gospel? What does this mean? What does this look like? You can describe the gospel in several different ways, but the gospel is essentially this. It is the good news that Jesus Christ came to this earth, that He lived the perfect life, that He died for our sins that we might be forgiven, that He was buried in the ground for 3 days, and then on the third day He was resurrected and came again to life. And that now He is at the Father's side in heaven, and that someday He will return and will take us to where He is. That's the gospel in a nutshell. That's the essence of the gospel. We think of a passage, when we think about the gospel, quite often we think about a passage like John 3:16. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever would believe in Him would not perish, but have everlasting life. Think about the themes, even in that verse. What about the themes? What does that look like for us to live those themes out? If that gospel is written on our heart, and if the gospel should affect the way we live, what are the themes? Look at, again, think about John 3:16. The verse starts off talking about God's love. God doesn't need us. God doesn't need us to somehow help Him or make Him better. And the Bible says in love, because God loved us. What are the themes of the gospel? Is this idea of love. Not self-serving love, not love because I get something in return. But it is this kind of altruistic, self-sacrificing love. We're going to live our lives in a manner that is worthy of the gospel of Christ, then people ought to look at us and say, wow, such and such is a loving person. People ought to come into the doors of this church and say, well, that's a group of just loving, kind people. They ought to walk in and they ought to immediately know that there's something different. And that's part of the idea. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. We talked about being citizens of heaven. If you are a citizen of a country, there's an expectation that you will act like a citizen of that country. I know when I went to Nepal 20 years ago or something now, we flew into Kathmandu, and on the very first day that we were in Nepal, a local Nepali pastor sat us down and said, listen, there's some things that you need to understand about the culture in Nepal. In other words, there's some things that you as kind of stupid, arrogant Americans need to not do while you're here. There's an expectation that while you're here, you're going to act, not in a bad way, but you're going to act like Nepalis. You're not going to offend anybody. They weren't big things, they're simple things. You don't point. Or you don't go like this, come here. That's an insult. I think it was turn your hand upside down and use all your fingers, to beckon somebody. You don't, and then again, this is kind of weird. We don't think about this in our culture. You do not step over somebody that is laying or sitting on the ground. And they say, well, okay, we wouldn't think about it. But understand, if you walk into a Nepali church, or if you were at a Nepali church earlier today, you would have a room like this, and everybody would be sitting on mats or rugs on the floor. There's no benches, there's no pews. So in a culture where it is much more common to actually sit on the floor, you can think, well, that makes sense. You don't step over somebody. That's impolite. It's considered rude. We wouldn't think about it. My point is, there was an expectation that when you're in Nepal, that you act like a Nepali, that you don't break some of these customs. That's some of what we see here in this text about living out the gospel, living as if you're a citizen of heaven. One of the traits of the gospel is love. As we as Christians, or we as a church, exist in fellowship and interact with one another, our love for each other ought to abound. You think through the gospel, another theme of the gospel is this idea of submission or sacrifice. We'll see this next week when we get to chapter 2. Verse 6, when it talks about Jesus did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. Instead, He emptied Himself. He gave up part of Himself. He submitted to God the Father. That's a theme that runs throughout the gospel. This idea of sacrifice, submission, selflessness, that's not ideas or concepts that we usually embrace in this culture. And yet that's woven through the gospel. What does it mean to live the gospel out? Part of what it means is to put others ahead of yourself. Part of what it means is that there are times when we have to sacrifice our wants or our desires, that we may have to submit in humility to others, that we might have to serve others. What else do we see in the gospel? We see this idea of justice. So this idea that God must punish sin. Do we have opportunity to live out, to advance the cause of justice in our culture and our community today? Is that not a very real and very relevant way that we can live out our Christian faith, is to promote and to pursue justice? Because we know that as we do that, we image God. God is a just God. Another theme I believe we see in the gospel is the idea of forgiveness, right? It's one of the reasons that Jesus came, that we might be forgiven. I look around and I think about Christians. Christians should be the most forgiving people in the world. Should be. Yet I know that we aren't always. And you could go on. I mean, we could talk about all these different attributes of the gospel, and I'm just thinking, live your life in a manner worthy. What does that mean? It means that those themes, those ideas that run through the gospel, they ought to run through our lives as well. Our lives ought to reflect those themes and those ideas. And that's a huge change. It's a huge change from who we used to be, or how we had kind of our humanity normally operate. You understand, I believe, when this is written to the church in Philippi, we see this, just one thing. One thing. Let me tell you something really important. Live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Going on, then whether I come and see you or am absent, I will hear that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, working side by side for the faith of the gospel, not being frightened in any way by your opponents. I think implicit in this idea, and we see in the text that there's a number of different word pictures that are used to describe what our relationships and our interactions look like. Implicit, though, in this is that there are opponents, that there will be conflict. That on some level we are engaged in a spiritual battle. That as we seek to live our lives in a manner worthy of the gospel of Jesus Christ, we will face opposition. And so the calling then is to stand firm. The calling then is to stand in one spirit with one mind, to work or to strive side by side. The picture of standing firm really is a military term. It's a military idea. If you think about a Roman legion with 1,000 soldiers, or you think about a modern army, or you go back to World War II and you think about the trench warfare in Europe, what was the goal? It's always to stand firm, shoulder to shoulder, and if nothing else, not retreat, not give up. This idea of striving together, of working together, again, is a picture. And instead of a military picture, this is an athletic picture. We think about an athletic team, whether it's basketball or football or whatever the sport is. But that's the image. It's an image of a team that is working together for the greater good, that's willing to sacrifice their individual accomplishments for something more. And in a sports sense, that's a championship. Those are victories. And when we looked at the church, we look at the kingdom of heaven, we look at advancing God, we look at glorifying Christ. And so the calling becomes then work together, strive together. And I think here again we see this issue. We know what the right answer is. We know what we're supposed to do. But just like I said a minute ago, that a church, that Christians ought to be the most forgiving people in the world. I think we say the same thing. Churches or Christians ought to be the most unified people in the world as well. And yet they're not always. I came across a story this past week. You can be the judge if it's true or not, but it's actually, I thought, rather witty, and it goes like this. It says a man was stranded on an island, so this proverbial, desert island in the middle of an ocean. And he's all by himself. There's nobody else on this island. It's just him and the coconut or whatever with the face on it. He's alone on this island for a number of years. Finally, these people figure out he's there, and they come to rescue him. They come ashore and whatever. And he says, look, before we leave, I want to show you around. I want to show you what I've been up to for these years by myself. And he took them to his hut, his house. He said, I built this all by myself. This is where I live. He said, wow, that's really great. And he took him a little ways off, and he says, this is the church that I built with my own two hands. I said, wow, that's terrific. It's a beautiful building. And as they were looking at the church, one of the group of rescuers pointed out at another building a little ways off. And he said, well, what's that building? And he said, well, that's where I used to go to church. But I don't anymore, because there was conflict. Wait for it, it'll come to you. But how often do we see that in churches? I mean, we're talking about living out the gospel. We're talking about striving and being unified and having one spirit and one mind and working together for a common goal. And yet division is all over the course of church history. I know when I was a kid, and I might have shared this already, but I know when I was a kid and we went to this, it wasn't a big church, Mennonite church in Marion, Pennsylvania. And we used to have fellowship meals, kind of on a somewhat regular basis, kind of like we do here. I love fellowship meals. I liked them when I was a kid, I like them now, always had a great time. For whatever reason, and I don't know if this was the culture of the area or if this was a Mennonite thing or whatever it was, but for whatever reason, whenever we'd have a church meal, they would always serve chicken noodle soup. No idea why, but they always did. Somebody made chicken noodle soup. But here's the thing. At the beginning of the line, or wherever the soup was in the line, there were always two big pots of soup. Identical. Everything about them was identical, except in one pot, the noodles were about this wide, and in the other pot, the noodles were about that wide. I know you probably can't see it, but it was like skinny noodles and wide noodles. You would go through the line, and there was always an individual there that would serve you the soup, I guess so you didn't splash it on yourself. Maybe it was just the kids they would serve it. I don't know. But the question was always, what kind of noodles do you want? Do you want the skinny ones or the fat ones? Same noodles. They didn't taste any different. But it was, for whatever reason, it was a big deal in this church. And somewhere along the line, there was a discussion. I don't know how animated it was, but somewhere along the line, there was a discussion about the width of the noodles in your chicken soup. Now, I don't think it ever got to the point where it divided or it split the church. But just know that discussion. As a matter of fact, that discussion took place. And yet, how many times have we seen it? And you can look it up, and you can hear stories and whatever of churches though that have split over the same kind of reasons, the same kind of ideas. Whether that is carpet or I don't even know. But there's a whole number of reasons. And so we laugh about the chicken soup, and yet I think we realize that in the context of the greater church, stuff like this happens. This isn't written in a vacuum. The church in Philippi probably wasn't any different than the church is here. In fact, we know it wasn't. You can turn ahead to Philippians chapter 4, the beginning of chapter 4, verse 2. Paul writes this. Again, this is to a real church at a real time with real people in it. I urge Euodia and I urge another individual whose name I can't pronounce to agree in the Lord. Yes, I also ask you, true partner, to help these women who have contended for the gospel at my side. We don't know what's going on. But whatever was going on in the church there at Philippi was severe enough to the extent where the Apostle Paul is writing from jail in Rome, and he's saying, by the way, you two that are fighting and arguing about this need to knock it off, and the rest of you there need to help these two individuals knock it off. Not really a whole lot different, I think, than we see in churches today sometimes. And yet there is this idea, what does it mean to live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ? It means that you'll be standing firm in one spirit with one mind, and you should be working side by side for the faith of the gospel. And I think that's the goal. I think that's the key. See, the reason that we fight about chicken noodle soup, or the reason that we get upset about carbon and just some of these insignificant things, is because at some point we allow our own wants or perceived needs, our desires to be bigger than God. At some point we lose focus of what really matters or what is really important, and we begin looking at ourselves. That's always the case when there is some kind of conflict like this. Now, as an aside, I realize that there are issues that are contentious. There are real, true gospel issues that are contentious and people have disagreements about, and there's a time and a place for those discussions and for those arguments, and we want to talk about the gospel, and when we talk about salvation and all of those things, I get it. There's legitimate disagreement, and at some point, maybe you agree to disagree. But I don't think that's what's going on here. So often I think we allow these other things to cloud our minds and to distract us from what really matters. And that's, I believe, the thrust of this passage is focus on what matters. One heart, one spirit, standing firm, working side by side for the faith of the gospel. The gospel. What Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 is the glory of Jesus Christ. The gospel of the glory of Jesus Christ, who is the image of God. That needs to be the focus, both in our lives individually, but also in our lives as a church. That is the piece that unites us, that holds us together. I don't know if you ever stop, and I know I have a different, maybe, perspective as I stand here and I look out. But have you ever stopped and just looked around this room? The variety of people and backgrounds and upbringings and issues and generational sins, but also of talents and gifts. It's huge. Just take a minute. Look around the room. There's 100 or whatever it is people in the room. You guys wouldn't know each other. We wouldn't know each other if it was not for this context. What brings us together is the gospel of Jesus Christ. What brings us together is God and our desire to live for Him and worship Him and serve Him. That's the piece that unites us. That's the piece that strengthens us. That's what brings us here. That's why we're here. That's why we're together. I thought about it, I guess I first thought about this, or was first kind of brought to my attention a long time ago. I was actually in Africa, and I was working on a building. It was like a pole barn. And we were taking it down so that they could move it to another location. I don't remember why, I just remember we were taking this thing down. And so I was the one that got to go up. It was just a skeleton of the building remaining. And I went up on what used to be the roof. And I started pulling, and John helped me out. These are the wood that tie the rafters together. Purlins? Purlins. Okay. So my job was to pull the purlins off the roof so that we could take the rafters down. No problem. So I climb up there, and I'm pulling these purlins off, and I'm handing them down. When I started, you could stand on that roof, and you could whatever, and it was solid. The more of those purlins that I pulled off, the weaker and the weaker that roof got. And I remember thinking, I was down to about, there's one kind of on each side. It's probably time to get down. Because that thing was really, you could feel it start to wobble and move a little bit. And the converse is true. If you've ever built a building and you start setting trusses up, if you just have one truss there, it's pretty weak on some level. I mean, it can hold a lot of vertical strength, but side to side, it's pretty weak. Have you ever thought about if you're building a building though, and you start setting the trusses and you start attaching those purlins, and all of a sudden, there's a lot more strength there, there's a lot more rigidity. And then you put the plywood on and it's stronger yet. because now it can't twist any way. Think about that in terms of the gospel, in terms of this idea of working side by side for the faith of the gospel. By ourselves, we are what we are, and I get that, but as a church, and again, this is written to a church, it's written to a body of believers just like this. By ourselves, we are what we are. Together, we are much stronger. But in order to be together, in order to be working and striving side by side, there has to be something that connects us. There has to be some purlins, there has to be some plywood, there has to be something that binds us together. And what Paul writes is that, those purlins, that thing that binds us together is the gospel of the glory of Jesus Christ. And here's the reason. Here's the reason why this is important. Paul takes a bit of an aside out as he's talking about this what it looks like to live out the gospel and these ideas of unity and all this. And he's going to come back to it at the beginning of chapter 2, but it's almost like we come to verse 28, and it's like he takes an aside for a minute. He says, this is what you need to do, and here's one of the reasons why it's important. Look at the beginning of verse 28. Not being frightened in any way by your opponents. Remember, we said a few minutes ago that all of this standing firm stuff implies that there's some opposition. When we get to verse 28 and we see the acknowledgement of that, not being frightened, and I lost the word, not being skittish, might actually be a more accurate translation. We miss it in English. When we read the Bible in English, I think we miss it sometimes. We miss a lot of these word pictures that if you spoke Greek or read Greek, which I don't, but if you read Greek, you would see the word pictures more clearly. This word that is translated here, frightened, could also be translated skittish. And just like I said, there was a military word and an athletic word. This term actually applies to horses. This is a horse word, an equine word. I don't know much about horses. I don't spend a lot of time around them per se. We have to. I mostly just look at them. Sometimes when I go out to talk to my cows, I talk to the horses because they're nosy, but mostly just look at them. Here's what I know about horses, though. Horses are incredibly intelligent, almost to the point that it's a problem. Like, they're kind of intelligent in a stupid way, if that makes sense. Like, they won't go across a bridge because they don't know what a bridge is. They will get scared of their own shadow sometimes because it's this thing that's beside them and is always following, and it makes them nervous. And yet they're highly intelligent. I mean, you can train these things. We have this horse, and I didn't even realize that you can train a horse to do what this horse supposedly does, like whatever the signal is, and that's where they're smarter than me. But evidently, if you're standing, whatever, you give them a signal, and they'll lead with one foot instead of the other. It's these crazy things. The horses are skittish. That's what the word was usually used for. They spook easily. Yesterday was London's birthday, so one of his birthday presents was some of those model rockets. We're building those. They're a lot of fun. If you haven't, you should, because it's always a good time. And anyway, so yesterday evening we went out in the backyard and we shot off some of these rockets. First rocket, it goes up. The horses are in the barn, right? First rocket goes up. Horses come out of the barn because they hear this noise and this commotion and want to see what's going on. Second rocket goes up. The horses run and they go back in the barn because they hear this noise and they don't know what's going on. Third rocket goes up. The horses come running back out of the barn, and this time they're bringing the cows with them because they've gotten everybody riled up because they don't understand what this sound and what this noise is. It's that skittish word. It's that spook word. And so what we see, the instruction we see is, look, don't be frightened, don't be skittish, don't be alarmed by your opponents. Why are we not frightened? Why are we not skittish? Why are we not alarmed? Well, several reasons, but one of them from this text, because as a group we are standing firm in one spirit. As a group we're working together because we have one mind and we're laboring and we're striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. Therefore, do not be frightened in any way by your opponents. This is evidence of their destruction, but of your deliverance And this is from God, for it has been given you on Christ's behalf not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. It's almost like there is a sign here. There's something about the unity and the oneness and the single-mindedness of believers. Something about living for the gospel and what the church is called to be. That the text tells us will be a sign. It's a sign for us of our salvation. It's a sign for us of our ultimate deliverance. It's a sign for us that there has been a transformation that has taken place in our hearts that allows us to love and forgive and pursue justice and forgiveness and surrender and submit to one another. It should be a sign that there's something different, there's something real. But on the flip side, the text rather bluntly, rather cavalierly says for your opponents, this unity, this type of loving, forgiving, self-sacrificing, single-minded unity is a sign to them of their destruction. And this is from God. This has been given to you. It's almost, the word is almost presented in such a way that this is a gift. We think of salvation as a gift, we think of faith as a gift, but the text also says that this idea of suffering at times is also a gift, and I realize that flies kind of counterculture to how we usually think about Christianity. And you cannot read the Gospels, you cannot read the words of Jesus without seeing that at times there will be opponents, without seeing that we are engaged in some kind of a spiritual battle. Jesus himself said in John 16, verse 33, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. For you will have suffering in this world, but take courage, I have overcome the world. We see this in Jesus' interaction with Peter. When Jesus tells his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, that he's going to be crucified and all of this, and the disciples and Peter in particular say, no, may this never be. Don't let this happen. This doesn't have to be this way. And Jesus looks at Satan, or looks at Peter, and rebukes him and says, get behind me, Satan. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life because of me and the gospel will save it. It's been said that God graciously gives his people suffering and faith so that they might enjoy magnifying Christ to their adversaries through the fearlessness of faith and humble love to each other. And that's the point. In our men's study this morning, we were in Acts chapter 8, and we saw the persecution was taking place, and persecution was breaking out. And that caused some of the early Christians to scatter throughout the region. And as they scattered, they began telling other people the gospel. And so, in fact, instead of being suppressed, the gospel grew. And the kingdom of God was advanced. That's part of the reason, I think, that suffering that opponents sometimes can be a gift. Because it allows us to see God at work. It allows God to use us and to shape us. It's been said that suffering is the friction that polishes our graces. I believe that's true. But suffering is more of a blessing and is more palatable when we are united as a group of Christians, when we're unified as a choice, as a church. As we close, let me leave you with these, the words from Martin Luther's Mighty Fortress is Our God. And though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God hath willed his truth to triumph through us. The prince of darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure. One little word shall fell him. Let's close with a word of prayer. God, we thank you for this text. We thank you for just what it says and how it instructs us and speaks to us. God, we think of this idea even of as being a church and being Christians and being unified. And God, may we be humble enough to confess that is a high calling, that is difficult. And yet again, may we also confess that by your grace we may do that. So God, would you work and move in our hearts? Would you draw us toward yourself? Would you just allow us and cause us to be more in love with the gospel, more in love with you? And God, even during those times when we may face opposition, when we may be condemned for our faith, for our beliefs, God, would you give us the courage to do what is right? Would you give us the courage to follow you? God, would you give us the courage as a church, as a body, to come alongside of each other and to encourage and to strengthen? God, would you give us the vision to see how you are at work even in those times, even in those moments? God, we're going to give you the praise and the glory. And we pray these things, we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Please stand.
Standing on the promises of Christ my King, through eternal ages let His praises ring. Glory in the highest I will shout and sing, standing on the promises of God. Standing, standing on the promises of God my Savior. I'm standing on the promises of God. Standing on the promises I cannot fail. When the howling storms of doubt and fear assail, by the living word of God I shall prevail. Standing on the promises of God. Standing on the promises of God, my Savior. I'm standing on the promises of God. Standing on the promises of Christ the Lord. Bound to Him eternally by love's strong cord. Overcoming daily with the Spirit's sword. Standing on the promises of God. Standing on the promises of God, my Savior. I'm standing on the promises of God. Standing on the promises I cannot fall. Listening every moment to the Spirit's call. Resting in my Savior as my all in all. Standing on the promises of God. Standing on the promises of God, my Savior. I'm standing on the promises of God.
Glory. All right. You can have a seat for just a minute. One of the promises, and I was thinking and just listening to the words, one of the promises of God is that when His word goes forth, that it will not return empty, that it will not return void. As Romans chapter 1 tells us, that the gospel is sufficient for salvation, for everyone that believes. And so, Jonathan, if you all want to come forward, Jonathan asked that if you just have a minute to share some of what God is doing in his life and how God is working and moving and changing. So I wanted to give him an opportunity. Yeah.
Well, on June 11th at 10:30 at night, I remember it vividly because Pastor said it was 7:30 and it was actually 10:30. I gave my life to Christ.
Amen.
Amen. And I grew up in a Christian home, knowing a lot of what's in Scripture. But for the last year and a half, I've been reading the Bible from front to back and realized stuff that I was reading wasn't adding up to how I was living. And then on June 11th, we came to a special thing that they were having at church. And the pastor, Greg Laurie, was talking about some family members putting together a puzzle and missing a piece of that puzzle. I said, man, that's what I've been missing all this time, is that piece of the puzzle. For all these years, I thought I had all this stuff under control. I was living my life, but all that time, God was just allowing me to do my own thing. And at 48 years old, almost 49, He let me know that I wasn't in control. He was. And so that's where I'm at in my life. And I know it's not going to be an easy journey, but I haven't been on an easy journey. And my desire is to follow Him.
Lord.
My wife also has something to say.
I also accepted Jesus in my heart that way too. It's been something I've been struggling with for years. And I've been listening to Greg Laurie for the past couple of months. In every service that he would preach, there was something that was touching my heart and softening my heart every single time I listened to him. I just couldn't get enough. And I read my Bible before and I didn't understand the words. I read the Bible now and he's talking to me every time. So I can't get enough. I can't wait to get up in the morning to start my prayers and get in my Bible. Have my time with God in the morning and every night before I go to bed. And I just feel so different.
Amen. Glory. Hallelujah.
And I just thank him for everything that he's done.
Can we pray with people? Would that be all right? Father, we thank you for the new word. You said it's every man your word also said, the natural man receives not the things of the Spirit of God. Foolishness to him, neither can they understand it. Because the word of God is spiritually understood by the Holy Spirit. We thank you that you got on these hearts, two hearts right here. You open them to understand. And now you live within them. Power of your Holy Spirit. We give you praise, we give you honor, and we thank you for the victory that they have in Christ Jesus, that understand the word, to live it according to your plan. We give you honor and praise in the name that's above every name. Knowing that the name of Jesus, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. To your glory. Amen.
As we leave, let's just stand up and sing the first verse and chorus of Grace Greater Than Our Sin.
Amen.